Every relationship contains a second conversation that is never spoken aloud. It unfolds silently beneath words, gestures, and routines. It is a negotiation of needs, fears, power, and belonging. Who is allowed to be vulnerable? Who must stay strong? Whose feelings take priority? Who adapts? And who remains unchanged? These questions are rarely discussed, yet they shape the emotional architecture of every bond we form. At first, love feels like recognition. We feel seen, chosen, and temporarily relieved of our private loneliness. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, another process begins. We start editing ourselves. A tone of voice softens. An opinion is withheld. A need is postponed. Not because we are asked to, but because we sense, often unconsciously, that full authenticity might cost us closeness. This is the first silent negotiation, the trade between truth and attachment. Attachment theory suggests that the human nervous system is wired to prioritize connection over self-expression. From infancy, survival depended on maintaining proximity to caregivers. The brain learned a simple rule: belonging equals safety. Abandonment equals danger. That ancient logic still operates inside adult relationships. When we feel even a hint of emotional threat, disapproval, withdrawal, disinterest, the nervous system activates subtle protective strategies. We comply, we appease, we retreat, we perform. What makes this tragic is not that we adapt. Adaptation is intelligent. It is how love survives imperfection. The tragedy is that over time, adaptation becomes identity. We forget which parts of ourselves were strategic compromises and which were genuine traits. The self slowly reshapes around what is permitted rather than what is true. Phenomenologically, this tension is felt as a low-grade unease, a quiet vigilance, a sense of walking slightly on eggshells, even in relationships that appear loving. You may feel strangely lonely beside someone who cares about you. You may feel safer discussing work stress than emotional pain. You may notice that certain topics never arise, not because they are resolved, but because they are dangerous. This is not deception. It is nervous system realism. Freud would have recognized this as repression, unacceptable feelings pushed out of awareness to preserve relational stability. Jung would call it the formation of a persona, a relational mask designed to be lovable. Adler might see it as a strategy to avoid inferiority or rejection. Modern neuroscience frames it as threat regulation, limbic circuits dampening expression to prevent attachment rupture. Different language, same truth. Intimacy is not just closeness, it is risk management. And so, two people fall in love not only with each other, but with each other's adaptations. Each unconsciously teaches the other what is rewarded and what is costly. Laughter is welcomed, sadness feels heavy, anger feels dangerous. Neediness feels shameful. Strength feels attractive. Independence feels safe. Soon the relationship stabilizes around these unspoken rules. Yet beneath this stability lies contradiction. We long to be fully known, but fear being fully seen. We want unconditional acceptance, but offer only conditional authenticity. We crave intimacy, yet negotiate it downward to avoid loss. This is why so many people report a peculiar experience, being in love and still feeling emotionally alone. The loneliness does not come from lack of connection. It comes from lack of permission. And this raises a quiet, unsettling question that lives inside every relationship. Which version of me is being loved right now? In daily life, the silent negotiations of a relationship reveal themselves not through dramatic conflict, but through subtle patterns of self-editing. They appear in the hesitation before sending a message, in the way a sentence is softened to avoid tension, in the choice to say, "It's fine," when something is not. These are not lies. They are micro-adjustments made in the name of emotional safety. One sign is the quiet shrinking of desire. You may notice that you stop asking for what you want, not because you no longer want it, but because wanting has begun to feel inconvenient. Needs are reframed as burdens. Longings are translated into practical requests. Vulnerability is disguised as humor. Over time, the psyche learns which emotional tones are welcome and which are costly. Joy feels safe, grief feels heavy, anger feels dangerous, Need feels shameful. Another sign is anticipatory self-censorship. Before speaking, you unconsciously simulate how your partner might react. Will they withdraw, get defensive, minimize, lose interest? This inner calculation happens in milliseconds, beneath awareness. The result is not silence, but filtration. Only the emotionally approved version of your experience is expressed. The rest remains internal, accumulating as unspoken residue. Many people interpret this as maturity. They tell themselves they are being reasonable, low maintenance, emotionally intelligent. And, in a sense, they are. These are sophisticated regulatory skills. But regulation becomes repression when it consistently protects the relationship at the expense of the self. Attachment theory offers a lens here. Anxiously attached individuals often minimize their needs to avoid abandonment. Avoidantly attached individuals minimize their needs to avoid engulfment. Different strategies, same outcome. Disowning vulnerability to preserve connection. The relationship becomes stable, but the self becomes smaller inside it. There is also the phenomenon of emotional role locking. One partner becomes the strong one, the other becomes the sensitive one. One becomes the caretaker, the other becomes the child. These roles reduce relational complexity and create predictability, but they also trap both people in partial identities. The strong one feels unseen. The sensitive one feels ashamed. Neither feels fully met. Neuroscientifically, this pattern is reinforced by threat-reward learning. When self-silencing prevents conflict, the brain releases relief. Relief is registered as reward. Dopamine encodes the behavior as adaptive. The nervous system learns, when I hide this part of myself, I stay connected. Over time, authenticity begins to feel risky, and inauthenticity begins to feel safe. Cognitively, this creates dissonance. We tell ourselves we are loved for who we are, while actively hiding parts of who we are. The mind resolves this contradiction by lowering expectations. This is just how relationships are. No one can meet all your needs. I shouldn't be so sensitive. These beliefs soothe anxiety, but they also normalize emotional deprivation. The result is a peculiar kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being accompanied while unseen. You are in the relationship, but not fully in yourself. You are close, but not transparent. You are loved, but not fully known. And slowly, almost invisibly, a grief emerges, not over what the relationship is, but over what you are no longer allowed to be within it. Beneath the silent negotiations of every relationship lies a deeper machinery, one that operates far below conscious intention. This machinery is not moral. It does not care about honesty, fairness, or romance. It cares about one thing: survival. From a neuroscientific perspective, intimacy is processed by the same neural circuits that once regulated attachment to caregivers. The amygdala scans for signs of threat. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors social pain. The ventral striatum encodes reward and approval. When connection feels secure, oxytocin and serotonin promote calm and bonding. When connection feels unstable, cortisol and adrenaline mobilize defensive behaviors. This means that every emotionally significant interaction is also a biological event. When a partner sighs, withdraws, or responds with subtle disinterest, the nervous system does not interpret it philosophically. It interprets it as danger. Even mild relational tension activates ancient attachment circuits that evolved to prevent abandonment. The body reacts before the mind can explain. This is why people often say, "I don't know why I didn't speak up. I just froze." Evolutionary psychology offers a harsh clarity here. For most of human history, exile from the group meant death. Belonging was not a luxury. It was a condition for survival. The brain therefore evolved to prioritize relational stability over personal authenticity. The individual who suppressed inconvenient feelings and maintained harmony was more likely to survive and reproduce. In other words, self-betrayal was adaptive. Freud would call these unconscious compromises defense mechanisms. Repression hides unacceptable feelings. Reaction formation transforms anger into kindness. Intellectualization replaces pain with analysis. All serve the same function. preserving attachment by muting emotional threat signals. Jung would say that these disowned emotions do not disappear. They retreat into the shadow self. The shadow contains everything we learned was unsafe to express: jealousy, dependency, rage, tenderness, need. We pretend these traits are not ours, yet they continue to shape our relationships indirectly, through passive aggression, withdrawal, over-control, or idealization. Adler would interpret the same pattern as compensation. When we feel relationally powerless, we overdevelop traits that restore a sense of superiority or control. Competence, humor, self-sufficiency, moral virtue. These traits are not fake, but they are exaggerated to protect wounded attachment needs. Modern neuroscience completes this picture. The brain is a prediction machine. It constantly updates models of what is safe and what is dangerous. If expressing sadness once led to rejection, the brain learns sadness equals threat. The next time sadness arises, inhibitory circuits suppress it before it reaches consciousness. You don't choose to hide your feelings. Your brain does it for you. Over time, this creates emotional blind spots. You genuinely no longer know what you feel or want. The psyche has outsourced self-awareness to threat avoidance. This is why silent negotiations feel involuntary. They are not strategic decisions. They are conditioned reflexes. Dopamine also plays a role. Approval, affection, and harmony activate reward circuits. The brain becomes addicted to relational peace. It begins to associate self-silencing with pleasure and authenticity with discomfort. What feels right is not what is true, but what is rewarded. This is how relationships quietly train personalities. The tragic irony is that the same mechanisms designed to preserve love slowly undermine intimacy. By hiding vulnerable parts of ourselves, we prevent genuine emotional attunement. The partner connects not to who we are, but to who we learn to be. And yet, from the brain's perspective, this distortion is rational. It reduces uncertainty. It increases predictability. It keeps abandonment at bay. The silent negotiations are not failures of courage. They are the nervous system doing its job too well. The silent negotiations inside relationships do not arise in a vacuum. They are shaped, intensified, and normalized by the social world in which those relationships exist. What feels like a private emotional dilemma is often the echo of a much larger historical and cultural script. In traditional societies, relationships were embedded in stable social structures. Families were interdependent. Roles were clearly defined. Survival depended on cooperation more than emotional fulfillment. Love was important, but not central. Belonging came before authenticity. Modern relationships, by contrast, are expected to do everything. They must provide intimacy, security, validation, eroticism, friendship, purpose, and personal growth. We now turn to one person to meet needs that were once distributed across entire communities. This creates impossible psychological pressure. Sociologist Anthony Giddens called this the pure relationship, a bond that exists solely for the emotional satisfaction it provides. In theory, this is liberating. In practice, it makes relationships profoundly fragile. When one person becomes your primary emotional ecosystem, the cost of relational rupture becomes catastrophic. And when the cost of rupture is high, self-silencing increases. Capitalist culture intensifies this further. Productivity, self-optimization, and emotional efficiency are rewarded. Emotional messiness is pathologized. Neediness is stigmatized. Vulnerability is tolerated only when it is brief, aesthetic, and inspirational. We are taught to communicate better, but not to need more. We are taught to regulate our emotions, but not to honor them. Social media compounds the distortion. We are constantly exposed to curated images of perfect intimacy, smiling couples, romantic gestures, aesthetic vulnerability. Conflict is hidden. Negotiation is invisible. Loneliness inside love is never shown. This creates a cruel comparison trap. When your own relationship feels effortful, tense, or quietly unsatisfying, you assume something is wrong with you or your partner. You don't see that every relationship is built on unspoken compromises. You only see your own. The result is modern relational shame. Gender socialization also plays a role. Many men are trained to suppress emotional need to preserve status and autonomy. Many women are trained to suppress anger and desire to preserve harmony and attractiveness. Different silences, same negotiation. Freud would describe this as the internalization of social prohibitions, the superego enforcing cultural rules inside the psyche. Jung would say that culture itself becomes part of the shadow, shaping which emotions are allowed to exist publicly. Adler would point to social comparison and status anxiety as drivers of relational performance. Neuroscience again closes the loop. The brain tracks not only personal experiences of rejection, but observed ones. When we see others punished for vulnerability, ridiculed online, abandoned, shamed, our nervous system updates its threat model. It learns, do not do that. So even before a partner gives us any reason to self-censor, culture has already trained us to. This is why silent negotiations feel inevitable. You are not only negotiating with your partner, you are negotiating with history, with culture, with gender norms, with economic precarity, with social surveillance. And so, the private self becomes smaller, not just to preserve love, but to survive modern life. In this context, authenticity becomes a radical act, not because it is morally superior, but because it violates the unspoken agreement of modern relationships. Do not need too much. Do not feel too much. Do not threaten stability. And yet, beneath all of this, the human nervous system still wants the same ancient thing: to be held in truth, not just in harmony. When silent negotiations persist long enough, they begin to reshape not only the individual, but the relationship itself. What started as small acts of emotional self-protection slowly calcify into relational distance. Intimacy becomes thinner, misunderstandings become chronic. Love remains, but it becomes strangely abstract, felt more as loyalty than as closeness. One of the first casualties is emotional attunement. Because both partners are filtering themselves, they are no longer responding to each other's true inner states. They are responding to curated versions. This creates a subtle but devastating mismatch. You feel unseen not because your partner doesn't care, but because they are relating to someone you are pretending to be. This is how people end up saying, "My partner loves me, but they don't really know me." Communication also becomes distorted. Conflicts are no longer about the real issues, but about their symbolic substitutes. Anger appears as irritation over dishes. Sadness appears as withdrawal. Loneliness appears as criticism. The surface argument is about logistics. The buried argument is about unmet emotional needs. John Bowlby's attachment theory explains why these misalignments are so painful. The attachment bond is not just about proximity. It is about being emotionally mirrored and regulated by another nervous system. When your vulnerability is not received, your brain registers it as relational danger. The pain is not metaphorical, it is neurological. Over time, this produces relational fatigue. Both partners sense that something is wrong, but neither can name it without threatening the fragile equilibrium. So they both try harder. They become more agreeable, more useful, more competent, more attractive, more self-controlled. Love becomes a performance. This performance often leads to resentment. The self that is constantly adapting begins to feel exploited, even when no exploitation is occurring. I give more than I receive. I am always the one who adjusts. No one takes care of me. These thoughts are not always objectively true, but emotionally, they feel true because parts of the self are starving. This is the relational paradox. The more you sacrifice yourself to preserve the relationship, the less capable you become of actually feeling loved within it. Another casualty is eroticism. Desire depends on authenticity. It thrives on the unpredictable emergence of the real self. When both partners are carefully managing their personas, erotic energy collapses. Sex becomes dutiful, transactional, or absent altogether. This is why so many long-term couples report sexual numbness alongside emotional numbness. It is not that attraction died, it is that aliveness did. Jung would say that the shadow eventually demands expression. What is repressed does not stay quiet. It leaks out through affairs, emotional withdrawal, addiction, or sudden exits. These are not random acts of selfishness. They are desperate attempts to recover a lost self. Adler would frame this as a rebellion against inferiority. The individual who has felt small in the relationship unconsciously seeks a context where they can feel large again, desired, powerful, seen. From a neuroscientific lens, chronic self-suppression leads to stress dysregulation. Cortisol remains elevated. The parasympathetic nervous system remains underactivated. The body never fully relaxes in the presence of the partner. Home no longer feels like home. And so, the relationship becomes a place of safety in theory, but not in experience. This is the quiet devastation of silent negotiations. They preserve the relationship's form while hollowing out its emotional substance. Two people remain together, but the selves who fell in love slowly disappear. When emotional safety feels unavailable, the psyche does not remain passive. It improvises. It develops coping strategies that are meant to protect the self from further pain, rejection, or annihilation. These strategies are rarely conscious. They are survival adaptations, psychological prosthetics for an environment that feels emotionally unsafe. One of the most common is emotional numbing. People gradually disconnect from their own inner experience. They stop naming feelings. They stop tracking desires. They stop noticing disappointment. This dissociation is not dramatic. It is subtle. It looks like, I'm fine. It feels like neutrality. But underneath, it is a quiet freezing of the self. Neuroscience shows that chronic emotional suppression dampens activity in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions responsible for emotional awareness and empathy. Over time, people literally lose access to their own feelings. They don't just hide vulnerability from others, they hide it from themselves. Another strategy is hyperindependence. The individual stops needing anything, or at least pretends to. They become self-sufficient, self-contained, invulnerable. This is often praised in modern culture, but psychologically, it is a trauma response. It is an avoidant attachment adaptation. I don't need anyone. I can handle everything myself. Depending on others is weak. These are not philosophies. They are scars. Others move in the opposite direction. Emotional overfunctioning. They become the caretaker, the fixer, the emotional manager of the relationship. They anticipate needs. They smooth conflicts. They sacrifice boundaries. This creates a sense of control and worth, but at the cost of authenticity. Freud would recognize these as defense mechanisms: repression, reaction formation, intellectualization. Jung would call them persona inflation, over-identifying with a role that wins love at the expense of the true self. Modern neuroscience frames them as nervous system strategies. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are not metaphors. They are biological states. Fight becomes criticism, control, dominance. Flight becomes withdrawal, avoidance, ghosting. Freeze becomes numbness, passivity, depression. Fawn becomes people-pleasing, over-accommodation, self-erasure. Social media amplifies all of this. Platforms reward performance, likability, and emotional spectacle. People curate personas not only for strangers, but for their partners. Vulnerability becomes content. Authenticity becomes branding. Even intimacy becomes performative. This creates a second layer of alienation. You are not only hiding your real self, you are optimizing a fake one. Dopamine becomes associated with validation. Serotonin becomes associated with approval. Love becomes confused with attention. Safety becomes confused with silence. Cognitive dissonance deepens the trap. If you have invested years into a relationship where you cannot be fully yourself, your mind will rationalize the pain. It's not that bad. All couples are like this. At least I'm not alone. I'm asking for too much. These thoughts are not truths. They are psychological anesthetics. Burnout follows. So does quiet despair. People begin to fantasize about escape, not always from the partner, but from their own life. Affairs, addictions, compulsive scrolling, emotional affairs, porn, workaholism, these are not moral failures. They are attempts at nervous system regulation. They are attempts to feel something without risking vulnerability. And yet, every coping strategy carries a hidden cost. The more you protect yourself from pain, the less capable you become of receiving love. You survive the relationship, but you slowly abandon yourself within it. Healing does not begin with fixing the relationship. It begins with telling the truth to oneself, a truth that is often more frightening than loneliness. The truth is this: many people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of being fully seen. Emotional safety is not merely something another person gives us. It is something our nervous system must learn to tolerate. For those shaped by inconsistent love, emotional neglect, or relational trauma, closeness itself feels dangerous. Intimacy activates threat responses. Vulnerability feels like exposure to annihilation. So, the first step in healing is not communication. It is capacity. The capacity to stay present with one's own emotions without numbing, fleeing, or performing. The capacity to feel grief without collapsing into despair. The capacity to feel anger without becoming destructive. The capacity to feel longing without outsourcing it to fantasy or addiction. From a neurobiological perspective, this is nervous system retraining. Practices like somatic awareness, mindfulness, trauma-informed therapy, and breath regulation gradually teach the brain that emotion is not lethal. The amygdala learns to stand down. The prefrontal cortex regains regulatory authority. The insula begins to light back up, restoring emotional literacy. In Jungian terms, this is the integration of the shadow self, the rejected, ashamed, needy, frightened parts of the psyche that were exiled to survive early relational pain. What we cannot hold in ourselves, we cannot safely bring into relationship. Attachment theory calls this earned secure attachment, a state where emotional regulation becomes internal rather than outsourced. This does not mean becoming hyper-independent. It means becoming self-connected. It means being able to say, I feel scared, and I am still here. I feel needy, and I am still worthy. I feel angry, and I am still safe to love. I feel empty, and I do not need to disappear. Only from this internal safety can relational safety emerge. Then comes the second phase, relational honesty. Not brutal honesty, not emotional dumping, but regulated vulnerability. Naming needs without accusation. Expressing hurt without character assassination. Setting boundaries without withdrawal. Saying, this matters to me, without apologizing for existing. This phase destabilizes many relationships, because the relationship you built to survive emotional unsafety may not survive emotional truth. Some partners will grow with you, others will resist, some will leave, not because you are too much, but because the old contract no longer works. This is where grief returns, not the grief of abandonment, but the grief of self-betrayal, grieving the years you stayed silent, the needs you minimized, the love you never asked for. This grief is not pathological. It is developmental completion. It is the psyche finally metabolizing pain that was postponed. Paradoxically, this grief creates more emotional safety than denial ever could, because now your inner world is no longer at war with itself. Love, at this stage, changes definition. It stops being, please don't leave me, and becomes, please meet me here. You no longer negotiate your existence for connection. You offer your reality and allow the relationship to respond. Some relationships will deepen beyond what you imagined. Others will end with dignity instead of resentment. Both outcomes are healing, because emotional safety is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-abandonment. In the end, the silent negotiations inside every relationship reveal something unsettling and liberating at the same time. We were never only negotiating with the other person. We were negotiating with our own fear of being alone, our terror of being unwanted, our ancient dread of emotional exile, every compromise that cost us our aliveness, every silence that swallowed our truth, every performance we offered instead of our real self. They were not moral failures. They were survival strategies. Freud believed that much of human suffering arises from the conflict between instinctual needs and the demands of civilization. Jung went further, suggesting that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It returns as fate. Adler saw our relational struggles as attempts to escape feelings of inferiority through belonging, power, or approval. Modern neuroscience now echoes these insights in biological language. The brain's primary directive is not happiness, it is safety. And for many of us, safety was once conditional. So we learned to shapeshift, to mute desire, to trade authenticity for attachment, to confuse love with proximity, to confuse stability with emotional anesthesia. Over time, these adaptations solidified into identity. I am the low-maintenance one. I am the strong one. I don't need much. I'm fine with whatever. But beneath these statements lived a quieter truth. I am afraid that if I ask for what I need, I will lose you. I am afraid that if you see all of me, you will leave. I am afraid that I am too much, or not enough. The deepest loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of self in one's own life. This is why loneliness can exist even in love, because the body knows when it is performing connection rather than inhabiting it. Because the nervous system knows when closeness is maintained through self-erasure. Because the psyche knows when belonging is being purchased with silence. Yet there is a quiet hope embedded in all of this. The same nervous system that learned fear can learn safety. The same psyche that learned to hide can learn to reveal. The same heart that learned to beg for crumbs can learn to receive a full meal. Healing does not require a perfect partner. It requires a courageous relationship with oneself. A relationship in which your emotions are not inconveniences. Your needs are not embarrassments. Your boundaries are not betrayals. Your vulnerability is not a liability. It requires the slow, often painful re-education of the inner world. Teaching the frightened child inside you that closeness no longer equals annihilation. Teaching the vigilant nervous system that love can be stable, not volatile. Teaching the adult self that loneliness is survivable, but self-abandonment is not. At this stage, love becomes something quieter and far more radical. It is no longer a negotiation. It is a meeting. Two people standing in their respective realities saying, "This is who I am. This is what I feel. This is what I need. This is what I can offer," and allowing the truth of that encounter to determine the shape of the relationship. Some relationships will end here, not in violence, not in betrayal, but in clarity. Others will begin again here, not in fantasy, not in fusion, but in mutual presence. This is not romantic. It is sacred, because it restores dignity to both love and loneliness. You are no longer using relationship to escape yourself, and you are no longer using solitude to punish yourself. You are finally inhabiting your own life. The silent negotiations end not when you get what you want from others, but when you stop bargaining away your own soul for connection. And perhaps this is the deepest form of intimacy available to a human being, to remain in relationship without leaving yourself behind.